Hi, Gordon. My question is, we hear so much about the costs of EU membership from both the stay and the leave campaigns, who then seem to call each other liars about their side of their story, and it leaves it very difficult for us to determine what return we are getting for our money as part of our EU membership. So, I've got some doubts about being in the EU or not. So my question is, can you tell us the truth about the real cost or benefits of EU membership, please?
Sure. A very important question, probably the one that gets asked most. Essentially, the Brexit campaigners say things like, oh, it cost 20 billion, 22 billion, 18 billion for the UK to be a member of the EU. And some of those figures, there's an element of truthiness about them, but also when you look into it, you realise that that isn't a good way to look at what it actually costs. Now, for instance, looking at the last few years of figures, or the last set of figures, it cost the UK, or the actual membership fee was £18 billion for the year. Now, £18 billion is a lot of money, but it's not fair to say that's what it costs to join, because there is a rebate paid to the UK of £5 billion. So that takes it down to £13 billion. And what happens is that the UK never pays the 18 billion. We pay the 13 billion, and other nations then go and pay the rest of it on our behalf. So countries like Greece, for instance, Ireland, Portugal chip in 125 million, but the major contributors are Italy and France. That's because they think they do rather well out of having Britain in, and they want us to stay. So if we vote to leave, are they going to be willing to pay that 5 billion for the last 2 years before we leave? That's an interesting issue. On top of that 13 billion, you also have to understand that the EU actually spends 4.5 billion in the UK. Most of that is 50-50 matching against the UK's spending priorities. So you've got a situation there where you actually end up with an actual net cost to the UK of £8.5 billion for an annual membership. Now that's a lot of money, but it ain't 20 billion or 22 billion pounds. So putting it into that context, it shows that both sides, or that the Brexit campaigners are exaggerating the actual net financial transactions of EU membership. But if you want to look at how it affects Scotland, you've got to actually look at that 13 billion figure, the pre-EU spend figure, because we've got 8.2% of the population, and therefore our population percentage share of the fee is about £1.1 billion. But the EU spends in Scotland £782 million. So it spends an awful lot more in Scotland per head than it does in the rest of the UK. So with 8.2% of the population, we get, I think it's 17.4% of all of the EU's expenditure for the UK. So you can see that the EU takes money from London and the South East, where it doesn't give many grants at all because they're very wealthy, and gives it to Scotland, to Wales and to Northern Ireland. So the centralisation, the pool of wealth and opportunity and political power to London and the South East is actually negated by the way the EU distributes the UK's membership fee. So essentially, you've got a cost to Scotland of £275 million a year after you look at what our fee is, our population percentage fee, of the UK's fee, minus the spend that the EU does, 275 million. And some reports get it to under 100 million pounds a year is what it costs Scotland to join. Northern Ireland and Wales make money out of joining. They're a net beneficiary in terms of the financial fees. So you're left with 275 million pound fee. What does that do to our economy? Well, many of the reports that I've seen look at between 2.5 and as much as 8 or 9% of your GDP is actually driven through access to the common market, being a member of the EU. Now in Scotland, that would be about 7 billion of our GDP, give or take, and that would filter through to about £2 billion worth of revenue for the government. So that's £2.2 billion that the government can spend in Scotland every year as a result of access to the common market. And therefore, you've got to say that the actual relationship between what we pay and what we get back is pretty good. Scotland does well out of EU membership, England not so well, and that's possibly why you see a difference in the polls between the two countries. So essentially, in financial terms, Scotland pays about 275 million for its membership once you subtract all the benefits and it drives about £2.2 billion worth of revenue for Scotland to spend. And I think that's, for me, that looks like a good deal, unless we really felt that the UK government would step in and replace all of that money, when it has a track record of, some would argue, doing exactly the opposite.